But I'd like to talk about an article that Chantal and I wrote for Leadership magazine in February 2008. We had a great title for this article. We noted people's anxiety about the future, so we wanted to call it For Fox's Sake. But the editor felt this was not in keeping with the dignity of his magazine. So Chantal and I called it The World and South Africa Beyond 2010. Nice, safe title. But it illustrates to a T the difference between being a hedgehog and a fox. What did we say in the article? We said that the world had been in a long boom for 25 years, from 1982 to 2007. I mean, that is one of the longest economic booms in modern history. There was a minor downturn in 91, a minor downturn in 2001, but nothing like the stop-start economies of the 60s and 70s. And in fact, the phrase long boom was first coined by an American scenario planner who succeeded Pierre Wack as the head of Royal Dutch Shell's scenario planning team. His name is Peter Schwartz, and he lives in Palo Alto, California. And some of you may have come across him because there's an organization called the Global Business Network, which he founded and which is now part of the Monitor Group. And Peter, in 1983, came up with the expression long boom. He said the world could go into an unprecedented period of prosperity for the rest of the century for two reasons. Number one, the rise of the East. At the time, it was Japan. I mean, Japan had a fantastic run in the 70s, repeated it in the 80s, and then hit the wall in 1990 when the property bubble burst. But then came the Asian tigers, Hong Kong, Singapore, Taiwan, South Korea, Malaysia. They had a great run in the 90s, and then they had financial difficulties. And in stepped the two Asian heavyweights, China and India. So we've had this wonderful infusion of new blood from the East. The second reason that Peter gave was that we were on the cusp of a new technology that he called microelectronics, the science of taking a large object and turning it into a small object by miniaturizing the circuits. And at the time, the only object produced by microelectronics was the Betamax video cassette recorder. But then, of course, came the personal computer in the late 80s, which led to the internet in the 90s, and then quite separately cell phones, which have led to Blackberries, iPhones, iPods, iPads, Kindles, and all the stuff we use today. So we've had that rare combination of new players plus an all-pervasive new technology. And the global economy grew at 3.5% per annum for those 25 years, and at times at over 5% per annum. In the words of a former British Prime Minister, Harold Macmillan, we've never had it so good. If you couldn't make money in the 90s, you'll never make money. But this is where the difference between hedgehogs and foxes come in. Because hedgehogs built the boom into their vision. I mean, think of all those governments that are now in such financial trouble. It's because their finance ministers and obviously leaders felt that it didn't matter if you added to your civil servants, paid them more money, added welfare programs, bought new government buildings, because the taxpayer base would forever expand. And of course, it didn't happen. And now, of course, they have to fund their commitments with debt. And so the one ratio that Chantal and I watch like a hawk is the national debt to GDP ratio. The recommended maximum in the European Union is 60%. Well, right now, Britain is 80%. America is 90%. Italy is 117%. Greece is 125%. And Japan tops the league at 200%. So you have a situation which John Maynard Keynes, probably the greatest modern economist, would never have envisaged, this magnitude of debt. I mean, he proposed that governments ran deficits during recessions to keep the economy going. But he would never have foreseen the level of debt that these governments had made. But it's not just governments, it's banks. I mean, wow. All those masters of the universe led to this sort of banking meltdown. I remember my son ringing me in 2007 from London saying, Dad, we've just heard what the bonus that our CEO is getting in the bank. So I said, how much? He said, £35 million. It's for 1 year's work. £35 million, because he was so intelligent. And, it was, the strategy was based on the fact that it didn't matter lending to dodgy borrowers, because if they couldn't repay their loans, you repossessed their house in 2 years' time. And because house prices went up forever, you sold it at a profit. You extinguished the mortgage, you pocketed the difference. Simple logic. But of course, it was invalid. And now the loss on subprime mortgage debt stands at around $1.5 trillion worldwide. So hedgehogs are very expensive when they're wrong. Chantal and I, in our second book, Games Foxes Play, offered an alternative scenario. We called it Hard Times. But it's no good just putting an alternative scenario on the table, because people will say to you, you know, you're just being like the Delphic Oracle. You can never be wrong. You're like an economist who says on the one hand and on the other, you know, give me a one-armed economist. What you have to do is provide the flags which would suggest that you're moving from one scenario to another, and put as much effort into identifying those flags, and then attach subjective probabilities to the scenarios. And the flag we chose in late 2006 was property values in America, because we recognized that American consumers were only spending more because they could borrow more, and they could only borrow more because their houses were worth more. And there's a particular index called the Case-Shiller Index, which measures property prices. And it flattened out in late 2006. It actually dropped in January 2007 for the first time in 20 years. Now, you don't say a flag's gone up for 1 month, but it dropped for 6 months in a row. So in June 2007, we were giving a 50% probability to the hard times scenario. Notice we hadn't dropped the long boom. It's like two racehorses, and you just adjusted the probabilities as the flags went up. Of course, when the stock market started declining in October, we jumped the percentage to 80% on hard times. And that's when we said to clients, for heaven's sake, you've got to work out your strategy now. What is the implication of a recession? What are you going to do to protect your cash flow? What are you going to do to retain your customer base? And 2008, 2009 were horrible years, and so far in 2010 it's been pretty tough. So what are the possibilities now? Well, the first one, I used a politician in America's expression, read my lips, is that the hard times continues for another 5 years. We've basically only come out of, you know, a tough, flat period around about 2016. Now, a lot of people feel that that sort of U scenario, we call it a corrugated U, because you'll have little ups and downs. It's not a double dip, by the way. A double dip is when things go really down again, and we're not talking of that. A double dip would be caused by, say, a war between America and Iran, an exogenous shock, or, you know, a trade war between China and America. We're talking of a flat period for 5 years. Because we think that's the amount of time it'll take for governments to work their problems out. Because it's a big difference between a government and a bank. Because a government can bail out a bank. But it's much more difficult for Angela Merkel to go to German taxpayers and say, we're going to bail out the Greeks. She can only do so by invoking the ABBA theme, bailing you, bailing me. You know, we'll all bail each other out. And we'll set up this huge fund. But it doesn't get rid of the underlying weaknesses of the European economy. So that's the first scenario, that we basically have a flat period for 5 years.